Life is full of ups and downs and the challenges that come with, and so many times, it just doesn't have to be that way. We could actually make some choices that allow us to continue to move ahead, but oftentimes growth happens in cycles. We get ahead and then we do something that kind of causes us to fall backwards, or somebody else can do something and kind of undercut us a little bit. But transitions are super important when it comes to leadership. We are a part of a loose network of churches. So we're not a denomination, but there are other Christian churches in the region, across the country, and the world that are making great things happen. And one of our partner churches is Third City Christian Church in Grand Island. So if you're ever in that neck of the woods, someplace to check out. But just recently, Pastor Scott had retired from Third City, and Scott had been there for 32 years. 32 years doing one ministry. When he started there, the church was under 200. To put that in perspective, we're running about 200 now. And now the church is over 2,000 people. So great things, right? Through the legacy. But the question is always, what's next? Right? So what do you do when somebody who's been serving for 32 years decides to retire? Who's next in charge? Who's going to take the next hill? Who's going to keep the people together? If you don't realize this, about any time, and it's not specific to the church, you change a leader, and a lot of times some of the people change as well. And so you have to go through this. I was fortunate enough in my last ministry in Minnesota that we were able to find someone who could start the following week after I left and provide a somewhat smooth transition. But even then, our personalities are different. The way that we lead is maybe a little bit different, and sometimes it is just a challenge. But I think one of the things that really helps with that is when there is an intentional transfer of leadership. So talking with Dan Walter, who's now the lead pastor at Third City, he shared with me that I don't know if our congregation will ever fully appreciate that 2.5 years ago, Scott began this conversation with our eldership to say, I'm going to be retiring and we need to start this transition process. I mean, that is a huge, huge thing for him in ministry. But as I look around and see the scope of church as it exists in Nebraska and in our region, I see so many guys who have been in the ministry leading strong for 20 plus years who are knocking on the doors of retirement. And one of the really difficult things is there's not a lot of people going into ministry to step up and replace those leaders. And it's not just them. There's other people in their staffs that are doing other types of ministries. And Bible colleges are closing down, and they're desperate for anybody that's coming in that's looking to do ministry. In the church planting world, we're talking about what does it look like to take people who are already doing a 9-to-5 job and also have them do ministry on top of that. So that maybe they're preaching or maybe they're leading worship or leading kids ministry, but they still get the benefits and the pay of having that regular job, but also they're working for the kingdom as a part of that. And I think, man, we've got to train up more and more people like that to fill that leadership void and to reach the people who are lost. Because this isn't really about maintaining church as we know it, like a Sunday morning service. It's really about how many people are dying or who are struggling in a hopeless eternity, a hopeless life without a relationship with Jesus. And what are we doing to actually care enough that we're willing to invest into their lives and make sacrifices to make that happen? And I think, golly, we could do so much. And so I'm excited to know that each summer, and you guys are going to see this, each summer we try to develop a teaching team. And so we have a few guys this summer that are going to be teaching out. And we do that strategically so that we're training up other people to know how to do it and what that looks like. And to go through some of those motions, we're training up new people into our oversight team so that they can lead the church from behind the scenes, a spot that many times goes overlooked and you don't see it. But just to know that that's taking place, or even within my role at the church, how does that change? Some of you know that when we started here in 2014, our goal wasn't just to be a church plant, meaning something that was started from the scratch, because every church comes from somewhere, right? But it wasn't just to start a church, but it's how can we be a church that plants new churches, that starts other works. And so in 2018, we were able to plant Forge Christian Church in Hastings, Nebraska. and just last year, Iglesia Cristiana Connection here at this facility. And it's not just us that's grown. ICC has been growing greatly as well, and we're seeing more and more people come to this faith in Jesus Christ. But I've been feeling the call from God to also help start a church planting network for other places in the state to be able to have this while also being the lead pastor here. And so if you haven't already seen it, you're going to see where Pastor Josh is speaking a little bit more frequently because we want to make sure that we're able to continue the mission and the ministry, not just of Connection, but of planting and starting more churches and seeing even more people come to a relationship with Jesus. And I think that those are awesome pieces. And that happens in a large part because we have so many people stepping up into ministry and really taking their faith seriously. We've had 6 people baptized so far this year. We have a 7th planned for this morning. That's exciting. But as we talk about leadership transitions, I also want to talk to you about 2 Samuel. 2 Samuel is on page 254 in the black Bibles we provide. If you want to follow along there, you sure can. 2 Samuel chapter 1. And we're seeing a leadership transition. This one probably didn't go as smooth as we would like, because there was no an exchanging of the baton, a transitional transfer of power. It was more like one administration was done because he was dead, and now the other one needed to get started. But oftentimes when you have a transfer of leadership, you also have squabbling within the ranks. Not everybody wants to follow the appointed leader, and so they choose their own person to follow. And there's tension that is just continuing to build. And so as we open up chapter 1, we see a continuation. This is a 2-part series, 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel. At the end of 1 Samuel, then Saul, who's been king of Israel, the first king they ever had, he dies in battle. Well, he takes his own life because he doesn't want to die in battle at the hand of the Philistines. Right? But it says he falls on his own sword. Well, enter in chapter 2, right, of the saga, chapter 1 of 2 Samuel, and now there's a man running into the scene. It's been 3 days since David has just won a victory over the Amalekites, which is to say some of the descendants of Israel that go way back, and it's also an execution of judgment on the people who were living in the promised land. Even though they were living there, the Israelites, and leading from there, they didn't drive out all of the people who previously lived there and who were living in rebellion to God. And so as we see the Amalekites kind of gather around, we need to know that this was a judgment call upon them. And so the question becomes, who is going to lead the charge? Who is going to take the mantle? And so this guy runs in. He falls before David. He's obviously been mourning. He's been lamenting. It tells us really in chapter 1, a man came from Saul's camp with clothes that were torn and dirt on his head. Right? And he fell at the ground and paid homage to David. He knew that David was a leader in the army. But his story doesn't quite add up. Some scholars, when they're digging into this, would say that maybe he was just lying. He was manipulating things so that he could gain favor with David. Right? David is obviously, he just won battle against the Amalekites. This guy would have a reason to side with the king. But David wants to know, okay, what gives? Tell me more about this story. So he says, well, the king and his sons are dead. How do you know that? Because I saw them. I happened to be on that mountain, and Saul had fallen on his spear, but he was still alive, and the Philistines were coming, and their chariots were coming, and he said that I needed to kill him, I needed to finish him off, and so I did, and then I grabbed some of his stuff, and I ran to you. David is cut to the heart, because David is a man who honors the position and the power of the king, regardless of who's sitting on the throne. So he mourns for Saul, and he mourns for Jonathan, his best friend. And then that evening, he goes back to this Amalekite and basically says this, how dare you lay hands on the king? And in a move of capital punishment, takes his life. It seems kind of odd. It seems like, why would this guy who has just come in and laid himself before David, who has just only did what Saul wanted him to do, like, why is he there? But he dishonored the position and the power of the king. And there may have even been a little bit more to the story. And so David then, he becomes king over not Israel, the whole nation, just a small portion of it, Judah. Well, what do we know of Judah? Well, this is the promised lineage of the Messiah, Jesus. So we go back to Judah. It's one of the 12 tribes of Israel. But the rest of Israel, they're following after Saul, more so the house of Saul. And Abner, the lead commander in Saul's army, has now appointed Saul's son, Ishbosheth, as the next king. And as he does so, then we see Ishbosheth as a guy who, I mean, he's doing his best, right? To lead the people, but there's a tension. Who's really in charge? Who's really the king? I mean, is it David? Or is it Saul's son? How do we know this? So God had an amazing plan. If we go back into 1 Samuel and see that when Saul began to act in rebellion, not doing the things God would want him to do, then he had the prophet Samuel anoint another king, David. And so years before David ever got to be in a position of king, God had already set him apart to do the job. And he always honored the king. And he always honored God. So we see that play out here. So Abner challenges Joab. Joab would be the leader of David's army to a little bit of a battle. So they gather together at a pool. They're on opposite sides. They each select 10 guys from among them, 12 guys from among them that are going to fight each other. So it's like, instead of saying, hey, let's all go out to fight and have a battle and then a bunch of people die, let's just select a few and then we'll have a competition. And so they do, and it's kind of a stalemate, and a lot of people die. And then not only do they not solve the problem, they end up fighting each other and get into a big battle. And it says that about 20 of David's men die, but 360 from the house of Saul. The small tribe actually annihilates way more than the rest of Israel. In the midst of this battle, so one of the brothers of Joab, the commander, is apparently pretty fast. He chases Abner, the commander of the leader of Saul's army, right? And as he's chasing him, he tries to get him to turn away and to not chase after him, but he doesn't relent. And so what he does, Abner, he takes the end of his spear, like the butt end, not even the pointy end, right? And jabs it back. As he's going back, the other guy's running forward, and it pierces all the way through his body, and believe it or not, he dies. That's kind of a painful way to go, I would imagine. The battle kind of concludes, but it's still like the fight is on. Like, who's in charge? What's the power structure looking like? Who is really the king? And I think it tells us a little bit of something about David's heart. Number one is that David continues to mourn. Right? He mourned for Saul and he mourned for Jonathan, and now he's mourning in this scenario as well. So Abner and Joab, they have a tension that exists between them, and Abner eventually loses his life to Joab because Joab wants some vengeance, and David doesn't like that either. He gives it over and mourns, and the people see that it wasn't really David that was behind this whole thing. That's a good way to plant the seed. It's a good way to kind of make things happen. But all of this time, Abner is like, he's sitting in the house of Ishbosheth, and he's growing in power, right? But at the same time he's growing in power, actually the house of Saul is actually losing power, and David's house is increasing in power. David takes on a few more wives. He's already got two. Kind of a Cliff Notes version of what's going on here is that David is is asked to marry one of the king's daughters, and he declines. And then the king offers another one, Michal, and he accepts. And then he runs from Saul, who kind of is chasing for his life because he's jealous, envious. Right? And so then Michal is taken away from David and given to another man. And then he marries 2 other women. And now when we open up this passage, we see in chapter 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 wives now for David. A man after God's own heart, but also a heart for the ladies. Right? So I want us to know that in this mess, because it's a mess, right? There is a power struggle. There is a vacuum at the top. Even though David has been anointed, the people don't necessarily just fall in line and start following David. And as he's rising, also are some of the chinks in his armor. And we begin to see some cracks in his character as he's going along here. And unfortunately, we see this, but inside of the house of Saul, we see Abner is accused by the king of having an inappropriate relationship with one of Saul's concubines. A concubine is somebody who has kind of some of the responsibilities of a wife without having the privileges of a wife. And as he's accused, he takes it pretty personal. And he decides that, he's going to not fight for the king now, and he's going to go side with Saul. So he changes teams. Right? I don't like the way that you're doing things, so I'm just going to leave you. You can have that. I'm going to go over with David, and David's going to become king of everything. I'll kind of show you what's going on. So he goes to make a covenant with David. A covenant is a binding agreement. And in verse 14 of chapter 3, it says, "Give me my wife Michal, for whom I paid the bridal price of 100 foreskins of the Philistines." He actually doubled that, 200. That means he killed a lot of people to make that happen. And it was really Saul trying to set him up to die. But he doesn't. Imagine this. So your first wife is pledged to you, taken from you. She marries another man. And now the other side is wanting to make an agreement. You're like, well, I need my wife back. Well, he's already moved on, apparently. And she's already moved on in another relationship. And we see in that the following verses, like her husband, Michal's husband, and he was crushed. He was weeping. He was chasing her all the way. And eventually Abner said, you need to just go back home. So he did. And David took on these other relationships. He was willing to break up another family for his own benefit, even though I get it, like it was kind of his wife to begin with, and how do we wrestle with that? The one person that's kind of hurt in the whole process is Joab, the leader in David's army, who Abner has killed the brother of. And so Joab takes his life. Again, David, not a big fan, brings that to the attention of the people. All the while, Ishbosheth, he's back home leading, but 2 of his captains, this is chapter 4 now, go in and assassinate him. And now they come to David. To which David says, did you hear about the Amalekite who took the life of King Saul? Yeah, he was executed. Guess what's going to happen to these 2 guys? Executed. Because David has a respect and an honor for the office of king. Some time passes before chapter 5, and we see that now some of the elders of Israel, when I say Israel, I want you to imagine this. This is how I picture it. So in the territory, Israel is mostly to the north. I comes before J. Judah is to the south, right? The other tribes are together, but now they're coming to David, who's ruling over the south. And then make an agreement with him to be able to come in. And David then is anointed king over all of Israel. 7 years for Judah and an additional 33 years over the entire province. He actually brings them together. There is progress being made. And in this, we can kind of begin to see some things taking place in David. Right? He was a great warrior, without a doubt. Great musician. Did some amazing things there as well. But one of the things that stands out to me is that he had a heart for God in that he inquired of the Lord. He inquired of the Lord. We see this in chapter 2, verse 1. Where do I rule from? As he's first getting the opportunity to lead the tribe of Judah. And so he then goes to Hebron and he leads from there. We get over to chapter 5 in verse 19. The Philistines are attacking and he wants to know from God, should I fight the Philistines? Will you give them into my hand? And God says, yes, I will. And then he inquires a few verses later, like how exactly do we win this fight? And God tells him, and each step of the way, he inquires, God responds, and he obeys. David inquires, and then he obeys. Do we see a contrast here? Those who are on this journey, we see a contrast between Saul, who was self-centered, right? Who was jealous and envious of others, who acted in vengeance, and David. David, who actually sought God and did what God wanted him to do. David, who actually would say, hey, you know what? Vengeance belongs to God, not to me. That's at least what we read about here in the passage. And so as we unpack this, I think it's important to understand that David inquired of God, and so should we. But that inquiring really needs to come with obedience. Matthew 28, right? Teach them to obey all that I have commanded. We go back to a previous passage that we read in 1 Samuel, that to obey is better than sacrifice. So he sets the stage. But we also see in chapter 6 an opportunity to obey that didn't quite pan out so well. So we go 2 Samuel, chapter 6, the Ark of the Covenant. The Ark of the Covenant was like this treasure chest of memories from God's provision to Israel over the years. I mean, it had a jar of manna that he provided for them in the wilderness. It had a copy of the Ten Commandments in it. This was viewed as the presence of God. It would go before them into battle. It would be a place that would center their worship. And through the life of Saul, the ministry of Saul, it was not with the people. And David wanted to restore it back where it belonged. The last time we really saw the Ark of the Covenant, the Philistines took it and placed it in their temple along with their god Dagon, who fell down before the Ark of the Covenant, and they put him back up, and he fell down again, and they pick him back up, and then they go back in and he's dismembered. Our God is better than your God is kind of the notion that's being played out here. And so the Philistines get rid of it and ship it back. Right? But now we're seeing David needs to go. Well, when they shipped it out, they didn't know the Jewish way of doing things. They didn't know what the Israelites were supposed to do, the commands of God. So they put it on a cart and sent it away. They actually kind of just pushed it like, hands off. Right? Because it led to some bad stuff for them. And now, so the house of Israel goes up to move it, and I mean, it makes sense logistically. Let's take a cart up there, a new cart. Let's make sure that we put it on here. It's got wheels. We can hook up oxen to it. We don't have to carry this thing ourselves, and let's get it moving. He takes 30,000 men with him to make sure this is happening. Apparently, they break out the band, and so they're having this big celebration as they're moving the Ark of the Covenant back to town where David has set up shop now, not at Hebron, but at Jerusalem. We see that Jerusalem would maybe be a little bit more centrally located for them. Jerusalem, the problem was it was inhabited by the Jebusites, which goes back to Esau, to Noah, to Ham, to Canaan, the Canaanites, right? And so now David needs to drive them out, but it's very well fortified. So what he does is he sends people up the water spout to go inside. And so then he is able to take control of that, but now he's taking the ark back. The oxen trip up on the way, though, and one of the guys reaches his hand out to steady the Ark of the Covenant so it doesn't fall over. Kind of an obscure passage when I think about it. I don't know if you've ever encountered this. You could be like, dude, like what gives? He's trying to do his best to protect this treasured possession of Israel, to keep anything bad from happening, and God strikes him dead because he touches it. But what he actually does is he is following in line of disobedience in the way that they're supposed to handle this. You won't catch that so much here in chapter 6 of 2 Samuel, but actually if you go back to 1 Chronicles 15, as they kind of overlap. We go back to 1 Chronicles 15, and we can see that now as David goes back to get the ark, because it's been sitting in somebody else's house for 3 months, and they've been doing well, and he's been building his city, and he's got a place for it now. He goes back, but he makes sure that he takes the Levites, and that they've been set apart because that was their job, to take care of the religious things. Right, so they go back, and they're not moving it with a cart, but with poles, the way that they're supposed to. And they offer a sacrifice every 6 steps. They've got the band back together because they're singing and praising, and he's dancing and jumping for joy. And great things are happening as the presence of God is restored to the palace. The place where it should have been. But I can tell you all the way along, the responsibility, the power is actually coming from the obedience to God. And God's power doesn't live miraculously just inside of a box. How does that convey to us? Sometimes we can think like, oh, the church, it's a holy place. Like if I step into this box, I better have my stuff together. But God has control of all things, in all places. He's the king. What we see in David is he honors the king, the office of king, not just of Israel, but he knows that the Lord, Yahweh, is the one true God. And whereas Saul did the wrong thing and just continued to double down and make excuses, David repents and seeks the right way to do things. And so we're seeing good things out of David and out of the way that he's bringing this in. And if we're not careful in our life, we can say, hey, I want the presence of God to come to me, and I want to be able to do great things because of God. I want to be able to experience his power and his peace and his provision, but I want God to do things my way. Right? I'm going to seek God, but I'm going to seek God to bless the things that I want him to do, not seeking God to tell me what to do. You see the difference? And this is a challenge, and the challenge continues to extend that if we invite God in, we can expect that God wants us to do things his way. And when we don't do things his way, we dishonor him, disrespect his office, and it doesn't usually end up well for us. And that was the case here. But they get the Ark of the Covenant brought in, and there's a big party as they come in. And David, instead of wearing like his kingly garments, is wearing a fine linen robe and an ephod, which is kind of this priestly garment. And he's dancing and singing for joy. And Michal, his first wife, peers out of the window and sees David, and she's just super excited. Let me tell you. Let's read this. Verse 16. As the ark of the Lord came into the city of David, Michal, the daughter of Saul, looked out of the window and saw King David leaping and dancing before the Lord, and she despised him in her heart. She didn't think he was acting with enough dignity, that other people were going to be looking on him, looking on her. Is it possible there's probably still some resentment from separating her from her second marriage? Maybe. We don't know. But we do know that when David got a chance to go through the feast and welcoming the ark back before the people, and he went home, and his women should be coming out and saying, oh, you're so awesome. Look at what you did. This is great. That wasn't the attitude of Michal. It says in verse 20, and David returned to bless his household, but Michal, the daughter of Saul, came out to meet David and said, how the king of Israel has honored himself today. This is sarcasm if you're not picking that up. Uncovering himself today before the eyes of his servants, female servants, as one of the vulgar fellows shamelessly uncovers himself. That was a huge amount of disrespect for the king. To which David is like, you know what? I'm sure I'll do even more in service to God. As David Crowder says, I'll become even more undignified than this. And then it just kind of adds this line, not necessarily as a punishment, but it's there, and maybe we can presume that she has no children because of that dishonor. Maybe the relationship doesn't really exist beyond this point, ever really recover. But God has a covenant with David, and he honors and he blesses David. If we read into chapter 7 and chapter 8, we see that David continues to fight for God and do amazing things, and God's blessing is with him, and he continues to win victory after victory because God is with him. But there's a couple things that I think are important for us to understand. Number one, David inquires of the Lord. Obedience unlocks the power of God. Not attendance, not giving, not even baptism. Obedience unlocks the power of God. It's God's power, it's not us. But he wants us to unite with him and to honor him as the one true king. David also honors the throne. He did this by executing the killer of Saul. He did this by executing the killer of Ishbosheth. And he believes, as it says in chapter 3, verse 39, that the Lord will repay the evildoers for their wrongs. The vengeance is his, which is a complete contrast to Saul, right? Who was trying to execute David, who was trying to execute Jonathan, who executed the priests that were providing for David when he was running, and the villagers that were nearby. Complete difference. And so we need to also honor the king. For us, it's not a king so much, right? But we have people in positions of authority ahead of us. And I think David sets a really good example of what it means to honor offices ahead of us, even when the people in that office maybe aren't worthy of such honor. The New Testament talks to us about praying for the leaders that God has appointed. It talks to us about making sure that we are subject to the governing authorities. And when it's saying that, they're under the oppression of the Roman government. This is not a posture of like we have the right person in the right place, but submitting to somebody who doesn't honor God. But I think we also see David beginning to crack. Right? He takes on these extra women. A couple different times we see that recorded in this section of Scripture. We see later on that there's tension within his household between his wives, between their children, and it begins to fall apart. David is still a man after God's own heart, and he still repents, and we're going to talk about this next week. But we also need to know that his power was never really the same. His position was never really the same as he began to unravel. When we got our Explorer this past summer, it had a big crack in the windshield. So we chose to replace that. I was a little surprised, $700 to replace a windshield. But we did that, and then guess what? Fall and winter happened, and we got another chip in our windshield. You probably have been there. If you drive at all, you know this frustration, right? And so you try to figure out, okay, what are we going to do with this? Like, do we pony up the cash and go get a new one again, just months later? Do we just let it go and see what happens? Right? And probably before long, like that thing has spidered out and it's everywhere. Or what we chose to do was acknowledge that we had a problem and we took it in and had it repaired with the hopes that that wouldn't spread. And David shows us that when there are cracks, we need to make sure that they're addressed before they become bigger issues. Because there are things in our life that threaten the integrity of our walk with God, of our relationship with Him, and not just ours, but affect our marriages. They affect our children and grandchildren. They affect our workplaces and everyone we come into encounters with. And we need to make sure that we're taking the time to address those inadequacies before they become big deals. It's a little bit hard to put things back in the box once they get out. And so here are 3 key questions that kind of help us process some of what we're learning about today. Number 1, what are you doing to inquire of the Lord? Not how are you asking God to bless what you want to do. Not how are you asking God to fix the problems that you want solved, but how are you inquiring what God wants to do? And then maybe how are you acting in obedience to that? One thing that I would suggest is that if you're not in the Word of God, you need to be in the Word of God because that's where He tells you what to do. And it's pretty hard to be obedient when you're not willing to listen to the instruction. Number 2, are you treating those in power with honor? Are you treating those in power with honor? This is a difficult position, but it's one that needs to be addressed. And the third is, what character issues in your life do you need to address? What character issues in life do you need to address? God uses broken people. God uses imperfect people. God used David, who mostly did some good stuff, but still had some issues. I'm guessing if you get to know the people around you, you'll find some people who are doing mostly good stuff, but they have some issues. Your pastor does mostly good stuff, but sometimes he has some issues. Ask his wife. Right? God can use that, but we still have to be humble enough to admit that we're not the king, we're not in charge, God is. And God has a way of doing things, and we need to respond in obedience. We need to address the cracks before they become major issues. So what is it that you need to address?